Hello and welcome to my session with SpiceWorld 2020. I'm excited to be presenting for the first time at SpiceWorld, and although I was certainly hoping to be in person for this, I'm definitely up for the challenge of pioneering an exciting virtual event. So with that, we're going to be talking about practical hacking. And when we think of advanced adversaries and vulnerability exploitation, it can seem overly complex at times. So my goal is to show you the practical attacks that I would perform. Over the next 30 minutes, we'll cover the first set of tactics, techniques, and procedures that an attacker would reach for if they had 30 minutes inside of your network. My name is Gary, and I currently work for Northwestern Mutual as an adversarial security engineer. Credit goes to my boss for the cool department name and title. I'm a penetration tester, or for more layman's terms, an ethical hacker. I've spent the last decade or so in various IT positions, primarily focused around systems administration, ERP systems, and really anything IT inside of the small to medium-sized business. I still moonlight as a contract penetration tester for an MSP focusing around that small to mid-sized business. Given my history, I'm no stranger to being the only IT person in the building. SpiceWorks has always helped me through those positions, so I'm hoping to do the same here. When I transitioned into security, it really blew my mind how basic some of the exploitation process was. I've been especially blown away by how common knowledge some of these techniques are, but how overlooked or misunderstood they were to me in my sysadmin days. I'm kind of hoping to show you the things that I wish somebody would have shown me so we can really realize the impact and effectiveness of some of the really most basic security principles. It's not uncommon for SMBs to want to test their security posture, and they'll end up paying as much as $10,000 to $20,000 on a penetration test where they get firmly reminded of some of the most basic principles and really how detrimental they can be to the business. For a starting point, especially in penetration testing engagements, it's really common to start from an assumed compromise position. And all this means is that we skip the initial access of the kill chain and assume that, somebody clicked the link, right? To simulate this and kind of speed things along, we'll put an attacker laptop on the network, both in the engagements and for this demo. This is actually not as unlikely as it might sound. I've certainly walked into lobbies that are completely unattended, and the type of lobby that has a phone on the desk and a directory so you can call whoever you're there to see. So I've used these VoIP phones before to plug in my attacking device and just start browsing the network with absolutely nobody around me. I've also certainly been to companies that claimed they needed weak web encryption on their wireless networks for old devices that are still in production, or even some wireless networks with no passwords at all. When we drop a laptop on the network to start attacking, in some ways it might even be considered one step more difficult than social engineering, since now I have to find an entry point into the domain network, right? With social engineering, I'll get code execution or a domain user that gives me their password, right? For our lab, I have an attacking VM inside of the domain network. So with that, we'll get started. First and foremost, every time is a tool called Responder. If you ask any penetration tester what the first tool they use is, the answer is almost unanimously going to be Responder. Before we see it, we need to understand why it works. So we need to talk a little bit about DNS. If we're all sharing a room right now, I'd ask, what happens to a DNS query when there's no record available? What happens to the network traffic? And probably pause and let a couple of brave souls chime in and kind of share what they thought. So see, a lot of times we don't really have to think about it as the only IT people available to an organization. We just have to make it work and not necessarily understand the exact packets being sent over the wire. So what's really happening with the DNS request is that a client is first going to check its local hosts file for any hostname references. Afterwards, it's going to query the DNS server that it has available. But if those DNS servers can't provide a response to that record, your Windows machine, it's going to make one last ditch effort to try and connect to the resource. It sends out a local broadcast packet asking if anybody on the network is server A or whatever the request was for. So this is actually the entire problem. Broadcast packets are inherently trusting. So if we think about ARP packets, when we broadcast out, who has this address? The other devices on the network know to drop the packet if it doesn't apply to them. But when something does reply, there's no mechanism in place to validate that reply. So what if we respond to the broadcast for a host name? Responder is a toolkit that listens for those broadcast name resolution requests and responds to them, telling the client that the attacking server is the resource that the client is looking for. Responder is built to accept a lot of different protocols, so if a client's looking for MSSQL, it can provide that connection. SMB shares, LDAP requests, FTP, HTTP, RDP, list goes on. Responder acts as a listener, responds and challenges the client, and then captures the client's response, giving us some form of credentials. So let's see one of the many ways that this could actually happen to you by exploiting it within my lab. In the lab, we have just a simple ESXi host with several VMs acting as an AD domain. So as a part of this setup, there used to be an old file server. One of the Windows clients still has shortcuts on the desktop that reference the old file server, despite the fact that it's been decommissioned for quite some time. So since that server is gone, there are no longer DNS records in place for that host either. So let's fire up the Windows client, the attacking system, and watch the requests happening in Wireshark, and then take advantage of those requests to capture a password hash. So we're going to start by logging into the Windows 10 client. All the usernames in this domain are actually inspired by family and friends' pets, so cats, dogs, hamsters. This one is obviously a Salem Fat Cat. So what we see right away when we log in is a shortcut on the desktop to an old file server. And there's also a map drive that's disconnected, but it still makes its attempts to connect unbeknownst to the user. So we're going to log into our attacking system now, and let's launch Wireshark so we can see what's happening. So what you'll see is when we trigger this shortcut, a request goes out to the network on the .255 broadcast address. And since nothing exists on the network, nothing's going to respond to this, but the whole process just fails to connect as it normally would. So now let's log out of this Windows 10 machine, and we're going to fire up Responder on the attacking system. Responder is going to listen for these requests, and since it has several listening protocols available, it's going to be able to respond to whatever the client is attempting to connect to. So now when we log into this Windows 10 machine, that map drive is going to attempt to connect the same way it always does, but this time Responder hears it and it challenges it to authenticate, capturing that username and password hash over the network. And when we look back at the victim, they've actually seen absolutely nothing happen, since this is really just part of the natural communication process. As an attacker, I will generally take this password hash offline to my password cracking rig and attempt to crack this password so I can log into the network with the normal username and password process. That's not all that can happen here. A password like this can also be relayed, so I could attempt to authenticate to other resources on the network without ever really knowing the password. Even better though, for the attacker that is, some protocols are far less complete. I've used this tool in engagements to get plain text credentials instead of the password hash. That's because some protocols just send plain text username and password information, so I would instantly see the password for that account. So what do you do about it? Simply put, you just disable these services. LLMNR is the link local multicast name resolution protocol, which is one protocol that will make these broadcast requests to the network, as well as the NBNS or NetBIOS name server protocol. Again, your clients will always attempt to connect via DNS record first, so having valid DNS records means that these protocols are actually never needed. LLMNR is a simple GPO change to disable the service, and NBNS has some DHCP options that you can set. If you're especially worried about it, you could also deploy deception technology. Personally, I've played around with something like the Canary Pi project on GitHub, which is a little device that periodically makes these requests on your network. And so if an attacker ever responded to this device, it would send out an alert to your department. Between the two, I would definitely choose to disable the services, but it's good to have both in place where possible. I actually really like the deception tech for small businesses that won't have the resources to log and detect and monitor everything. Just set a few of these traps on your network that attackers are likely to trip over, traps that would likely never go off otherwise. Canary tokens at canarytokens.org would be a great free resource to look into for more of that type of deception tech. Old devices. It should not be surprising to know that an attacker loves seeing old stuff on your network. I definitely thought twice about adding a section to this presentation with Windows XP in it, given how old it is now. But I do still see it, and many machines like this that are still around, they're online for a purpose, and they really are irreplaceable, or at least not easily or cheaply replaced. So for that reason, I thought it was worth keeping, and now I'm starting to see that translation into leftover Windows 7 machines. These types of machines have seen years of abuse and generally have some sort of a connection back into the network, like a batch file to map drives or a connection to a SQL database, or even just user login passwords that are reused elsewhere, which is a good segue into LAPS, the local admin password solution. If I can get into your XP machine and you have a standard account configured on all of your networked computers, then I will easily and quickly get an account that's good through your entire network. Laps is simple enough to deploy that we should really never have standardized admin accounts anywhere. So that aside, to take advantage of this XP machine, we're going to show the infamous Eternal Blue exploit originally developed by the NSA. We'll get full access to the XP machine, rummage around a little bit and see some hard-coded passwords, and then ultimately I'll show you what I would do with admin access on any computer by dumping the password hashes from Windows. We'll take those and we'll use those on the network as an example of what I might do to move laterally. It always comes up, we don't use this for the internet, so we're fine. An internet connection was never how I was going to attack this machine anyway, but please don't try to connect to the internet with your XP machines. The first thing we're going to do is scan the network from an attacker machine. So for this demo, I'll be running Nmap and checking for any open SMB or server message block ports. So this would be port 445. I'm also going to launch Metasploit. Metasploit is a framework that's used by penetration testers and by attackers to execute these exploits. Nmap can do host detection based on the TCP fingerprinted responses from machines. So we can tell when we see an XP machine or really any other Windows client for that matter. So here we see the Windows XP machine listening on SMB port 445. In Metasploit, there's a pre-built module available for Eternal Blue or CVE MS1710. So we're going to load that and aim it at the XP machine. And it really is as simple as point and shoot. We just set the IP address of the XP machine and then we can run the exploit. This one has a check module which lets us analyze it, and it's going to show us that it should be vulnerable, so then we can proceed to exploit it. Now what we get back is a reverse shell connection from the XP machine. So now the attacker has a full admin command prompt for that XP machine. We can run commands on this machine now as if we were sitting right in front of it. So with access to a machine, the first thing I'm going to do is rummage through it for additional information that I might be able to use throughout the rest of the network. In this example, I've placed some hard-coded SQL credentials in a configuration file, so we can see kind of what type of thing we might be looking for. Something like that would let me move from an XP machine into SQL databases. Using Eternal Blue is really, it's so simple and quick that there isn't much to show you other than the access that I have now. So I want to take the opportunity to show you what else I might do. Using Metasploit, I can run hash dump, which presents me with all of the username and password hashes that are stored on this machine for authentication. So just like before, I could take these password hashes offline and attempt to crack them so I can use the passwords in other places, but what if I don't need to? These are just standard NTLM authentication password hashes, and in this case, I can use these password hashes directly on the wire to attempt to authenticate to other systems. So here we're doing just that. We're using a tool called CrackMapExec to take that username, Azul, my boy Blue, and his password hash, and we're spraying across that /24 network, and we get a hit back on a Windows 10 machine where the username and password hash have been accepted. So knowing that the username and password hash have been accepted, I can psexec into that Windows 10 machine with my password hash and get a command prompt from that Windows 10 machine. This gives me shell access to the machine without ever actually knowing what the password was. So imagine that the username and password hash that we're using here is a local admin, and it's the same local admin that you use on every machine. That's how easy it is for me to take advantage of that information and just start using it absolutely everywhere throughout the network. First off, any old devices should be replaced, right? That's the right answer. It's the quick answer. It's the safest answer. Replace the old devices and keep all of your systems patched so you don't fall prey to an exploit like this. But the reason I still wanted to talk about this is because I understand that there are times when machines like this can't be decommissioned. Really, the best answer for those machines is to turn off the listening ports. Use the host firewall to prevent the inbound communication. If the XP machine isn't listening on the SMB ports, there's no opportunity to exploit the SMB protocol. Barring that, get creative with ACLs on your switches to limit the communication to the hosts that need to be able to talk to the old machines, like whatever app server it's talking with, right? And again, I'll take this time to mention that LAPS can really help standardize local admin accounts. Here we just witnessed how easy it is to retrieve those local password hashes, and without LAPS, that means I can be an admin everywhere in your network. Default credentials. Arguably, this should have been number two. This section is truly disheartening. When I talk about companies that pay extraordinary amounts of money for a penetration test to ultimately be reminded of the simple things that they're doing wrong, this is exactly what I'm talking about. In many of these penetration testing engagements that I do, I go from no access to a domain admin level of access, and quite often it's because of default credentials on products inside of the network. So often we get into the mindset that we build up a secure perimeter with a good edge firewall and closed ports, and then we kind of let our guard down on the internal network because an attacker would already have to be inside the network. And the result is that a lot of small to medium-sized business networks are like hard candy. There's a good hard shell on the outside, but they're just really soft inside. I see default credentials on switches, which gives me insights into multiple networks that I might not have known about, maybe mirror ports to help listen in for any unencrypted traffic. Default SNMP strings are far too common since many networking devices have SNMP enabled and listening by default. A lot of internally used software has default credentials that never gets changed. Point is, if I don't get into your network with Responder, I'm getting in through something with default credentials. Most commonly, this is through printers with default credentials to the web management portal. And I really wanted to demo this because of how common it is, but my lab is entirely virtual. I really didn't think my wife would be okay with me getting a big 4 foot tall multifunction printer and setting it up in our house, and then also telling her that we can't use it because it's part of my isolated virtual lab environment. It's not too hard to visualize though. When I log into a multifunction printer, they're often configured with other services, like a scan to network folder type of service. So after what we've seen with Responder, I could simply log into the printer, modify the host address for the scan to folder configuration, and click submit. And the printer interface is going to attempt to authenticate to the SMB share on my attacking machine. And responder is going to step in and it's going to capture that password hash. And afterwards, I just change your printer back to the original settings and start using the username and password hash to access the network. It doesn't really stop here though. I've used this technique to gain network credentials from other network appliances too. For example, I've worked with a fax server appliance that used default credentials. The fax server appliance delivered incoming faxes to the email inbox of users, and it did this by querying AD with an LDAP connection. I logged into the fax server, pointed it to my own LDAP service, and retrieved the plain text username and password. I've also seen devices configured with an SMTP email server. So in the same regard, I log in with the default credentials, point the SMTP configuration to my own attacking SMTP server, and again, capture that plain text username and password. Given how common this ends up being an attack path for me, I knew I had to demo at least one default credentials application. So in the demo, I'm going to show a WordPress server with default credentials, but it's true for so many applications. If we think back to early 2019, PRTG had an authenticated remote code execution flaw. This meant that if a user could log into PRTG, they could execute commands on the server that was running the application. The thing is, you needed to be able to log in to exploit the flaw, which isn't really very hard when you're using the default credentials. I've also seen companies with systems that run on top of something like Apache Tomcat. In at least one case, the company ran their inventory software on top of Tomcat, but didn't ever directly use Tomcat at all. As an attacker, I just use the default credentials to log in and start executing commands on the server. And again, this takes me from zero access on the network to executing system level commands on your servers. For the demo, we have a Windows server that's running XAMPP. That's the cross-platform version of the LAMP stack, Linux, Apache, MySQL, and PHP, and that's installed to host our WordPress server. The XAMPP stack also has Tomcat available, so I could see if that was something I wanted to demo, but we're going to look at this WordPress server. WordPress has their default install require better passwords, but it makes for a good demo, and lazy people use admin admin or admin password all the time, which may as well be default credentials. I've certainly seen WordPress configurations with lazy configs like that. So once again, we're going to jump into Metasploit because it just makes things ridiculously easy to break into. And just like the Eternal Blue exploit, there's a module for getting into WordPress servers if you have the username and password. So this uploads a custom PHP file that we can use to execute commands and ultimately provide a reverse shell connection back to the attacker. It's worth noticing that in this case, the antivirus hasn't even noticed that I'm connected to the server. And if we look at the process that's running, it's running with the highest privileges possible on a Windows machine because the application is installed and running as a service. Really not a whole lot to be said here, just, don't use default credentials. You already know this, but seriously, it grants me access into every network penetration test I've ever done. This is such a simple thing to fix, and it's constantly overlooked, and it really, truly does break my heart. You can spend tens of thousands of dollars on new security products, and it's all for nothing if you haven't gone through the exercise of correcting all of your default credentials. We've seen a couple of different ways that I might be able to get access to usernames and passwords on the network, or how I might extract usernames and password hashes from Windows machines that I gain admin access to. Kind of like we saw with the XP machine where Metasploit performed the hash dump, and now we just got access to the Windows server where we could do the same thing. So at this point, we're going to connect to the Windows 10 machine, and in this case, we're going to be an admin on that Windows 10 machine, but any standard domain user account is good enough for us to start attacking Active Directory. We could use this user's access to do domain queries to LDAP or Active Directory and start doing password sprays. As a domain user, I can query every single AD user object and attempt to log in with the username and some common password like summer 2020. Using group policy to set local admin passwords used to be a common attack, but not so much anymore. So just make sure you're not doing it. And again, local admin password solution. What we're going to demo is an attack called Kerberoasting, and Kerberoasting queries Active Directory for accounts that are known as SPNs or service principal names. These AD accounts exist to advertise registered services, so most commonly I see SPN accounts for Microsoft SQL servers within the domain. So again, we're a domain user logged into the Windows 10 machine, and we're going to query Active Directory for SPN accounts. From the Windows machine, I can use PowerShell to do this. And there are scripts out there to help facilitate this. So we're going to use one from GitHub and load it into the PowerShell session. As an attacker, I usually have a connection into the command line, and by loading the script with invoke expression, I'm loading the functionality of this script into memory only with nothing writing to disk, so you might be unaware that I'm even on your machine. Now, Kerberoasting works because of the design of the SPN request. I'm requesting the SPN accounts from Active Directory and then requesting the service ticket, or TGS, from Kerberos to be able to talk with the application or service. So what it does is it responds with an encrypted service ticket, and it's encrypted with the password hash of that service account. So we're capturing that password hash for an SPN account, and we can attempt to crack that with a password cracker. This could also be done from an attacking machine if needed, and even using a password hash instead of the plain text password. So we could run this password hash through something like John the Ripper or Hashcat. Both of them are password cracking utilities, and attempt to retrieve the plain text password. Often these SPN accounts are either overprivileged, like domain admin accounts, or at the very least, they're local admins on the servers that utilize these accounts. So here we can see that if we run the password hash through John the Ripper, it returns the password as database 1 for the SQL service account. The best mitigation for curve roasting is a long and complex password, like really long. These are passwords that you likely almost never rotate in your network, so they need to be extremely long. And ideally, you are actually rotating these passwords at least yearly. We've seen password hashes a lot in these demos, and I'm continually referring to how we want to crack these hashes to retrieve the plain text password. You've probably seen charts like these that lead you into a false sense of security and have you convinced that 8-character passwords are still okay. They are absolutely not okay. My personal laptop can crack your 8-character password within minutes. Uppercase, lowercase, numbers, and symbols. An actual password cracking rig that's dedicated to this purpose can crack your 8-character password instantly. According to this chart, a 10-character password takes 1,000 years to crack, but I've cracked 10-character passwords on my home laptop. This chart is constantly moving. So unfortunately, we're out of time and there's so much more that I wanted to cover. I'm hoping that some of this information is or will be helpful so I can make a habit out of presenting basic attacker techniques that you can mitigate. Everything I've shown here is the offensive side of security. This is how I get in, this is how I use the information against you. And I know for me, it was far easier for me to understand how to defend against these attacks once I knew what the attackers would actually be doing. Personally, I think you need to know both sides, the attackers and defenders, in order to be good at either one of them. So let's take a couple of moments here to talk about your key takeaways and some of the homework that you can do on your network. So first, it's really simple for you to change all of your default credentials, and this really does need to happen. Make a point to go through your entire network and attempt to log into each device. If an attacker can Nmap scan your network and get additional access through this, it's well worth creating a ticket or a project and just fixing this. We also want to turn off some of those default broadcast protocols that Responder is so good at picking up. I'll give you some references for this, but for extra credit, look into the WPAD proxy settings that it used to pick up. WPAD is still an attack path over IPv6, so it's worth knowing about it if you're going to read the material. We probably already knew this, but absolutely everything needs to be updated and patched on all of our network devices. Missing patches leaves us open to exploitation, and if Metasploit has a module for it, it's remarkably easy for anybody to launch these attacks. In my opinion, I'd rather take the risk of an update that doesn't play nice versus explaining to my CEO that we're under a ransomware attack because I didn't properly patch systems. Finally, I think we all need to learn to have a higher respect for passwords. I can't confidently recommend anything less than 16-character passwords for your users. Really start to adopt the mentality of passphrases instead of passwords. When users create passphrases, they'll naturally exceed 16 characters quite often. Service accounts and other passwords that don't change frequently really should be as long as your systems will allow them to be. Personally, I'll just log on to the LastPass website and use their password generator, crank the slider all the way to the right, and create a random password that's no less than 30 characters. And along the lines of having that higher respect for passwords, make sure your password documentation isn't just sitting in an openly accessible file somewhere on your network. Don't be afraid to use a password manager for your documentation. So if there's one resource that you should look into as a result of this session, it would be the Cred Defense Toolkit from Black Hills Information Security. As the name implies, it's a suite of tools that'll help you work through each of these problems. It can help you create deception tech like honey accounts that will alert on possible Kerber roasting attacks. It can identify the usage of Responder within your network. It can ID password sprays and help you get good passwords set up in your AD domain. It's a great one-stop shop for a lot of the things that we talked about today. So if you go through everything in that post, you'll really help eliminate a lot of the attacker's first steps within your network. Some of the other resources here are these links for Responder, and it's just a good article on both sides. It shows the attack in motion, but shows some of the details about mitigating it by disabling some of these broadcast protocols. If you download these PowerPoint slides for the links, I'll also have some other ones in there. Like you can see the Canary Pi GitHub project, which is a great way to send out these packets that Responder would normally pick up, and it alerts your IT department about the activity. But there's other Canary type detection methods like canarytokens.org, which is well worth looking into. As far as LAPS goes, this was the article that I used when I started deploying this for customers. It's broken into two sections, which really makes sense for deployment. You do the first step, which installs LAPS on your domain computers, and give it a day for the GPO to take effect and start installing in some places, and then move on to the second section, which actually configures it. I think it's still probably one of the better articles out there for going through this procedure. And finally, this is just an article I found that backs up my own opinions about enforcing 16-character passwords or longer and then changing those passwords less frequently, stuff like that. Everybody likes articles that back up their own opinions, so this one's mine. Okay, it's time for any questions that you might have, but if you're anything like me, you won't think of any good questions until well after this session is over. So feel free to contact me. The email here is just a personal 365 premium account that I have for experimenting. Otherwise, reach out to me on SpiceWorks or LinkedIn or anywhere else you can find me. I'm pretty open to answering any questions that you might come up with.